5th of December, 1941. Outside Moscow, near Klin, minus 30 degrees. German troops are close enough to hear the city in their imagination, but far enough to die on frozen roads trying to reach it. More than 3 million Axis soldiers have already pushed over 1,000 miles since June, and the Soviet Union has already lost millions of men, killed, wounded, or captured, and it still does not collapse. So why doesn't it break? But here's the question. What if Hitler treated Slavs as partners? What if German propaganda promised liberation, not enslavement? What if Soviet prisoners were fed, not starved, and then armed? What if Ukrainians, Belarusians, and Russians were offered real autonomy instead of racial contempt?
3,500 feet.
What if the occupation was built to recruit, not to terrorize? Could they have
2,000.
won? The answer reveals something uncomfortable, and it's
3 to
not
1.
what you think, because this is not a story about kindness. It's a story about manpower,
But it's 3-0
logistics, legitimacy,
down in blood
and
and flame.
time. One decision, one ideological switch. Does the Soviet Union crack first, or does Germany still hit the same
Morning
wall?
patrol.
Drop your prediction
They're good
in
plane.
the comments right now and subscribe if you want real history logic, not myths. Let's set the rules. What stays the same? Hitler still wants a continental empire. Germany still launches the invasion in the summer of 1941 with the same operational talent, the same culture of fast encirclement, and the same weakness, fuel and logistics. Stalin still runs a terror state that has starved and purged its own people, and the Red Army still begins the war disorganized, shocked, and bleeding. What changes is the poison at the center. Instead of treating Slavs as subhuman labor to be exploited and displaced, the Reich sells the war in the East as a coalition. Not equality, not democracy, not friendship, partnership for a shared enemy. A bargain. Help us destroy Bolshevism, and you will get land, religion, local government, and a future. And that changes everything, because in the real war, Germany didn't just fight the Red Army. Germany fought the Red Army, the geography, and the consequences of its own brutality. Now, zoom out. When Germany invades, huge numbers of people in the Soviet borderlands do not greet Stalin as a beloved father. They've lived through forced collectivization, famine, purges, arrests, and fear. That resentment is real, and it's a weapon, if you know how to use it. But Germany largely wastes it. Instead of presenting itself as a liberator, it often arrives as a new master. Instead of recruiting mass support, it fuels resistance. Instead of turning millions of captured soldiers into a political weapon, it turns them into corpses. So the counterfactual in this title is not a fantasy about good Nazis. It is a cold question about strategy. If Germany had offered partnership, could it have converted Soviet weakness into Soviet collapse? To answer that, you have to understand what holds the Soviet Union together in 1941. It's not comfort, it's not freedom, it's fear, habit, propaganda, and the simple fact that the alternative looks worse. And Germany makes the alternative look worse. That is the part nobody wants to say out loud, because it turns the war into a moral trap. Stalin's system is monstrous. But Germany's racial war is so openly predatory that it forces millions to choose the devil they know. Now imagine the switch. Imagine German troops crossing the border with strict orders. No mass reprisals, no racial language, no hunger plan, no village burnings as policy. Imagine every captured Red Army soldier being processed, fed, and offered a choice. Break when the coalition's promises look fake, or when the coalition's leaders look contemptuous, or when the coalition's casualty rate looks like exploitation. So Germany would have to do two things at once: win the front-line campaign and build a political coalition in the rear. That is a massive administrative task. And Germany's occupation apparatus was not built for partnership. It was built for control. So even with the ideological switch, Germany still has a competence gap. Now zoom out again and look at the core strategic objective. Germany needs a decisive outcome before the Soviet state learns to fight modern war under pressure. That is the same in every timeline. Partnership helps Germany most in the early window, 1941 into 1942, because that's when Soviet weakness is greatest and popular resentment is most exploitable. If Germany cannot force decision by the end of that window, the war starts turning into something else: production and endurance. and production favors the side with depth and resources. The Soviet Union has enormous manpower, it has internal oil, it has a deep interior, it can relocate factories and keep producing in places the invader cannot easily reach. Germany can improve its situation by not wasting manpower in occupation disasters, but it cannot change geography. So the question becomes, does partnership give Germany enough extra strength to win before the war becomes a grind? Let's test it in 3 pressure points. First, pressure point Moscow. If Germany can concentrate harder, maintain logistics better, and keep more combat divisions at the front because local allies secure the rear, it has a better chance of taking Moscow. Taking Moscow is not magical, but it is disruptive. It is a rail hub, it is a communications center, it is a symbol that affects morale across the system. And in a partnership scenario, Moscow falling could be amplified politically. It would look like the Soviet center is broken and alternatives are real. That could trigger cascades. Second pressure point, the South and the grain. Partnership could reduce the self-defeating brutality that makes farmers resist. If German policy is buy and recruit instead of seize and punish, agricultural output might be less sabotaged, less hidden, less destroyed. That matters because armies run on calories, and Germany in the east is always hungry, literally. Third pressure point, the Caucasus. If Germany can advance toward oil with better rear security and more auxiliary manpower, it might push deeper and hold longer. But here's the catch. Oil fields are not victory. Oil is not gasoline. Even captured oil has to be repaired, refined, transported, and defended. That is a long pipeline of requirements, and the Soviet Union does not have to recapture the oil fields immediately to win. It only has to deny Germany the ability to turn oil into mobility. So, partnership makes the oil gamble more plausible, but it does not remove the fundamental fragility. Now, zoom out and compare the 2 possible futures. Future 1, partnership works early. Mass defections increase. Rear areas are less hostile. Germany takes Moscow, or at least shatters central cohesion. Stalin's grip weakens as alternatives appear. A coalition government forms in parts of the occupied territories, creating a legitimacy crisis for the Soviet state. In this future, the Soviet Union can crack politically before it stabilizes militarily. That is the only path to a German win that does not rely on conquering the entire country. Future 2. Partnership works partially, but not decisively. Germany gains manpower for rear security and some frontline support. Partisan war is reduced, but not eliminated. The Red Army still retreats, rebuilds, and learns. The Soviet state survives, adapts, and eventually outlasts Germany's fuel and replacement pool. In this future, Germany does better than in the real timeline, but still fails to achieve decision. The war becomes a slower grind, and Germany still runs out of the one thing it cannot manufacture fast enough: time. So which is more likely? Here's where the title's shift nobody mentions becomes clear. Treating Slavs as partners is not a minor moral footnote. It is a strategic multiplier because it attacks the Soviet Union where it is most vulnerable early: legitimacy. But legitimacy cuts both ways. Germany's regime would have to restrain itself from racial policy, economic plunder, and humiliation. It would have to behave consistently across millions of interactions. It would have to train soldiers and administrators to treat local populations as allies. And that is not just hard. It is structurally alien to the Nazi system. So even in a what-if, the partnership has a built-in instability. The moment a German unit breaks the rules, burns a village, massacres prisoners, treats recruits as disposable, the coalition starts to rot. Because people in occupied lands are not stupid. They judge by behavior, not posters. And Stalin would exploit every betrayal instantly. He would frame the partnership as a lie. He would point to every atrocity as proof. He would tighten terror, execute collaborators' families, and turn the war into a moral survival story again. Now zoom into the soldier on the front line. A Soviet soldier in 1941 is not only fighting for Stalin, he is fighting because retreat can mean execution, because surrender can mean death, because his family is behind him, because his unit is his only shelter in a collapsing world. If Germany offers partnership, it changes what surrender means. If surrender means food and a rifle against the regime you hate, surrender becomes a political act, not a death sentence. That could increase surrenders in the early campaign, which would deepen the Red Army's crisis, and that changes everything. Because the Red Army can survive enormous casualties if it believes the state will survive. But if whole formations start choosing an alternative, the war shifts from military collapse to political collapse. That is the nightmare scenario for Stalin. So why didn't it happen in the real world? Because Hitler could not accept it. Because the Nazi project in the East was not designed to recruit Slavs as partners. It was designed to dominate them, and that decision, more than many battlefield choices, locked Germany into a war of annihilation that produced resistance, not collaboration. Now, here is the plain answer you came for. If Hitler treated Slavs as partners, meaning real autonomy promises, humane treatment of prisoners, restrained occupation behavior, and mass recruitment into anti-Stalin forces, Germany would almost certainly have been stronger on the Eastern Front in the crucial early window. It would have faced fewer rear area fires. It would have gained more auxiliary manpower. It would have made Stalin's legitimacy problem worse, and it could have increased the risk of Soviet political fracture in 1941 and early 1942. But even then, a German victory is not guaranteed, because Germany would still be fighting geography. It would still be racing fuel. It would still be trying to force a decisive outcome before the Soviet system stabilized and before a long war exposed Germany's structural weaknesses. So, the most honest conclusion is this. Partnership is one of the few counterfactual changes that could plausibly move the Soviet Union closer to breaking early. If the Soviet Union does not break early, then Germany still drifts toward the same long war trap, just slower and with fewer self-inflicted wounds. Now, return to the opening image. 5th of December 1941, minus 30 degrees outside Moscow. In the real timeline, Germany is freezing at the end of a campaign it could not finish, and the Soviet Union is surviving a catastrophe it should not have survived. In this what if, the front line might look similar. Same cold, same distance, same exhausted men, but the rear would look different. Fewer villages on fire, more local units guarding roads, more Soviet prisoners alive, armed, and fighting on a different side. And that is the shift nobody mentions because it forces you to admit a brutal truth. Wars are not only won by weapons, they are won by choices that change who is willing to fight, who is willing to surrender, and who believes the future belongs to them. So what would you do if you were making the decision inside Berlin? Would you trade ideology for pragmatism, partner with the people you plan to enslave because it might crack the Soviet Union early? Or would you stick to the regime's racial project and accept that it guarantees a longer, bloodier war? Which choice changes the outcome more? Drop your answer in the comments. Subscribe for real history, systems, constraints, and the decisions that actually moved the war. Thanks for watching.